A big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video.
Morning, it's fantastic to see you all again. Are you staying here, Pebbles, for the whole... You're just going to watch? Okay, you stay there. So, oh, you're going? You're just going to sit down there? So, how many times have you got back into Lightroom and just had sort of this feeling? Oh no, and your images just haven't worked as you planned them. You know, you thought you got everything right in the field, you sort of followed all the setup procedures, you're taking your time, but it still just didn't quite work. And that happens to me all the time. But what I find is that if you've got a good photo or a bad photo, you know whether it's good or bad, but trying to understand why it doesn't work is often quite difficult. Now, I've spoken a lot about the sort of 4 principles that I think a good photo has, and that's light, timing, some sort of subject, and then composition. And it's that composition element that's often difficult to get right, really. So what I want to do in this video is talk not about composition rules, but some principles that I use when I get back to review my photos that helps me understand why they haven't worked. And I'm going to show you some examples. I've got 7 of these principles that I follow. I'm going along with my 7 series. And yeah, they're around things like edges, simplicity, your eye and resting point for your eye. And then things like space and balance and separation of subjects. So I'm going to go through them all. So let's go and have a look at some examples. So the first one, there's really no excuse not to get this right, you know, when you're in location really. And that is just making sure your edges are right. So quite often an image doesn't work because you've cropped something incorrectly or there's something just disturbing at the edge of the photo. So take this for an example. This was a photo actually on my vacation in Cornwall with my family, and we were doing some photography. We actually had a photo competition. My kids like to take photos on their iPhones and have a little mini competition. And we found this location by the harbour here, and it was low tide and it looked really good. There was these amazing colourful houses in the background. The light just didn't quite work, but we got this shot. Now, when I got back, I just didn't notice that I cropped it incorrectly, and the boat on the right-hand side, I just cropped in. And actually, if I'd have thought about it when I was in location, I could have made a better job of this. But trying to crop this image, it doesn't really work by cropping that boat out on the right-hand side. You can do, and it sort of makes an okay image. But I think it's a little bit too tight on the boat. So what I should have done is just spent a little bit more time looking at those edges when I was in location. And it's one thing that I try and check all the time. And this one's another example where I'll come onto this image later as well, because there's another mistake in this image, which is why I don't think it works. But again, I feel that I included the 2 trees on either side on purpose, but on the left hand side you can just see there's a tree approaching just at the top left, and again that just doesn't work. I tried sort of cropping it down and getting a bit tighter, but what I needed to do was just move left or right just to try and get a better composition. So I've learned something there. You know, these are ones that I probably didn't spend enough time in the field, but you really need to check your edges. So the next thing to think about is having a route through your image, and by that I mean a route that your eye can take through your image, and trying to think when you compose it how your eye is going to go through that image. It's very pleasing as a viewer to be able to follow a route through the image that's pre-described. So I'll give you an example of where this works really well, but first I'll show you an example of where it doesn't work. And again, this was this location that I showed in my last video, which was stunning. It was this amazing spot in Lofoten, and I tried to conclude these foreground rocks, and it just doesn't work. They overpower the scene a little bit, but there's no route through this scene. It's not really obvious where you're coming in it from the left or from the right, or do you come in it from the top? When you're in it, where do you go? Do you go left or right? And it's just not obvious really. Whereas if you compare it to this image, which was a slightly different location, you can see that I've got the foreground and then the midground and then the distance, and it's fairly obvious that you start at the foreground, you sort of follow this S-curve down through the image to the fjord in the bottom, and then up to these magnificent mountains in the background. And then you see the sky and the clouds on top of this mountain. So there's a really pre-described route leading your eye to these mountains in the background, which is the final resting point. So the next one is really obvious, and it's something that is really difficult in landscape photography, and that is simplicity. Simplicity is something that nature's not great at. When you go into a woodland, or if you go to the top of a mountain, there's a lot of complicated things happening, and what it's our jobs as photographers is to simplify that and to try and find the most simple composition we can that sort of tells the story and captures the mood of that location, as I spoke about in last week's video. And going back to this shot that I just showed before, that's another great example of a shot that's not simple. You can see here that I've taken this same vista in two different angles, and these two different angles both don't work because the image isn't simple. Whereas if I zoom in on this area of this photo and just go with a longer lens, then I can simplify the scene and create something that's much more pleasing to look at. So that's often the case. Don't always think when you've got a vista that you can go wide angle, because sometimes it's difficult with a wide angle lens to simplify it because you're capturing so much of the scene. You've got to have the right scene to use a wide angle lens, and quite often you're better using a mid or a long lens when you've got a vista just to capture something in there to make it simpler. So when I zoomed in I got this, or if I zoomed into this area of the image here, you can see that I got this image, which was one of my favourite shots from this particular location. So by simplifying the shot, you can get something that's a lot more powerful, and you'll see a lot of my images, they tend to be fairly simple. Okay, the next point to talk about is a resting point, and having a resting point in your image. I think it's really important to have somewhere in your image, and it might be, actually sometimes I have images that have a couple of resting points, but you need to have somewhere in your image where your eye can rest. It can have a rest from just looking around the image and looking at different things. You don't want to be darting left, right and centre. You want to have that resting point. So for this image, for example, of this amazing ancient oak woodland that I've started to photograph, it just doesn't work. And when I looked at it, there's a few things that drag the eye, like the highlight at the top left as you look at it. But mainly I think that it just doesn't have a resting point. It doesn't have a point where my eye can rest on the image. I think I'm trying to look for maybe a subject, or I'm trying to look for a point where I should rest, but it just makes me a little bit uncomfortable looking at it. Now sometimes that can work, sometimes that can be the right dynamic, but usually in landscape photography you want to have that resting point. Again, this image here, there's no real resting point. It was beautiful light, I got carried away with it, but I didn't think a little bit more about the composition. If I had just turned left a little bit, I could have used that valley as the resting point, but there isn't enough of that valley included in the image to actually make that work. Whereas if you look at this image here, where again I had amazing light, there's a great resting point. It's this lake here, which is Tittersworth Reservoir actually, and as I'm looking at the image there, I can go into that valley, I can go down the valley, and that my eye rests on that lake, and then I can sort of explore the rest of the image and see all the other things within the image. But having that resting point, having somewhere where your eye can go to, is really useful. Okay, the next thing is something that I'm fairly passionate about. I talk about when I'm on workshops and try to explain to people about separation. I think it's really, really important to get a good image. So the first image I want to show you is this image that I showed you right at the beginning. And actually I think the biggest problem with this image is actually a lack of separation. So you can see that this tree here on the left hand side is sort of connected to both trees. It's almost like holding hands with them. But it just doesn't work because of that. There needs to be a little bit of separation, just separating these trees. And that would have been difficult to do. Maybe if I'd have gone a bit closer or gone a bit further away or gone higher or lower, I might be able to get that separation. I think I remember when I took this, I did try and I couldn't. And the separation of the elements doesn't necessarily have to be trees touching. It can just be where you place something to give it space. So a good example of that is this in January on my calendar, and this is a church in Iceland, and you can see that I thought really hard about the separation of this church, where I placed it on the mountain to separate it from the rocks in the background here. I wanted to separate it here from this wall at the bottom, and I also wanted to separate this spire here in this little gap that there is in the rocks as well. So by thinking about that, and by thinking about that separation, this allowed me to get an image that was just a little bit more powerful than it would have been if I'd have just taken a photo of that church and wouldn't have thought exactly where those pieces were going to be in the image. There's another good example as well. When I was on my vacation, I took some images of my kids just going into the sunset, doing some bodyboarding, boogie boarding in the US. And you can see that these first two images, there's no separation between the three of them. But the third image that I took, which is the one I wanted, they're all separated. You can see there were a group of kids running towards the ocean, but by having that separation, it just makes it a more powerful composition and a better photo. So think about separation, it will definitely improve your photography. Okay, the next one, which is sort of like separation, is space. So you could say that church is got some space as well. But really when I'm talking about space, I'm talking about having sort of negative space potentially, or having space for the image to breathe a little bit. Now, this image that I took with my drone is a good example of that not working. So there's just not enough space at the top of the image where the mountain is. I just need more space there. It just feels confined. And because it feels confined, it just doesn't have that sort of grandeur that it should have. This is Glencoe in the winter. It should look magnificent, but it just doesn't look magnificent because it doesn't have that space to breathe. Whereas this image here, I've used negative space quite strongly in this black and white image of this tree and the storm coming in. In fact, it was a passing storm going through. And by including that negative space, it just lets the image breathe and produces a much more powerful shot. So think about space. You can think about it in lots of ways. Think about the left and right. Are you leaving enough space? Are you leaving enough space at the bottom? And are you leaving enough space at the top? I tend to think about the bottom as having space that you can go into the image, and the top of having space that holds you into the image. And if you think about those two things together, then I think that can really help. Okay, the final thing is balance. And balance is something that's quite difficult to get right sometimes. And it's actually something that I find I notice more when I look at it in Lightroom than I do when I'm in location. I'm still trying to improve that part of my photography. And this is a good example. I was in Torridon here, and it was a magnificent morning. We'd hiked up in the dark, got to this location. There was this river going down, and I took this shot here, but it just doesn't work because the image isn't balanced. I've got the foreground overpowers the magnificent mountains in the background, and these trees and the mountains and the river just aren't balanced correctly. Whereas if you look at this image here, which was actually taken with almost the same focal length, it's just a little bit longer. I think the first one was around about 20 millimeters, this is about 26 millimeters. But I balanced the scene, so the rocks and the mountain and the trees are all balanced together, and it sort of holds the scene better together. So thinking about balance, thinking about how things sort of sit together can work really well. Okay, I hope that's helped. I hope that's given you some food for thought, and you can go away and use some of those to maybe critique some of the photos that you've got that maybe haven't worked. And then, when you go out, you can try and apply those in the field and improve your photography. Before I go, I've just got a couple of things that I want to talk about. The first one is a new series of videos that I'm going to launch. So I've been holding off this for a while, thinking of whether I should do it or not do it, but it's something that I'm fairly passionate about doing, so I've decided to do it. So I'm going to start doing more videos in the middle of the week. Now, they're not going to be regular, they're not going to be every week, but they're going to be about the photographer's toolkit. So it's going to be what tools that I use that I think have made a significant difference to my photography. So it might be something like my camera, it might be something to do with my computer, it might be a bit of software, it might be anything around the accessories or the tools or the software that I use that I don't really feel that fits into my Sunday videos, which are more about improving your photography regardless of what tools you've got. But tools are important. People often ask me questions about it, and I've sort of held off sharing a lot of information about it, but now I'm going to start doing that a little bit more. I've also got some exciting new tech that I'm using as well. So one of the things that I've got at the moment is this Narbox 2, which is a backup device, which I'm I'm testing. It's going to be launched, I think, in September, and I'll talk more about that in one of these videos as well. But it's, you know, that's having a really great impact on my photography and my workflow of my photography as well. So if you're interested in knowing when they're released, and I've spoken about this a lot, but these are definitely happening now. I've recorded 2 of them, so they're going to be coming out very, very soon. Then make sure you click the bell icon. I don't know where that is, down here somewhere. Click the bell icon to make sure you get notified of any releases that I do midweek. Okay, before I go, I just want to mention the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace, which are an awesome all-in-one website solution. And you know, they've enabled me to do so much with my photography, because it's just made it so simple to actually update my website, which is an important thing for me as a professional photographer, but it was also important when I was an amateur photographer as well. I wanted to share my photos and show people my work. So if you haven't got a website, then make sure you take a look at squarespace.com, and if you're ready for a trial of it, then you can get 10% off your purchase at squarespace.com/Nigel. Now, and what's great about Squarespace is you don't just need to have one site, you can set up multiple sites. So I've set up another site called Capture Landscapes, which has got all the information about my workshops, and I'm going to be announcing new workshops next week. So if you're interested in them, make sure you sign up for my newsletter, and then check out the website Capture Landscapes, and they'll be published on there. I think there's going to be one in the Faroe Islands and maybe one in the Lake District and Scotland. So if you're interested in going to one of my workshops, then make sure you check that out. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks ever so much for watching. And until next Sunday, or maybe one day in the week, bye.